3 years later, that billionaire would stand before a crowd of thousands and say that the most important business deal of his life happened in his own kitchen, with a 5-year-old boy and a woman whose name he hadn't even bothered to learn. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you think you know about love, family, and the walls we build between ourselves and others. This is the story of how a 5-second moment in a kitchen completely shattered a billionaire's world and rebuilt it into something more beautiful than he ever imagined possible. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the smallest hands and the biggest hearts. And sometimes the person you least expect becomes the one who saves your entire family. This story will stay with you long after it ends. I promise you that. Let me take you back to the beginning. At Manhattan's Upper East Side, the Sterling penthouse overlooking Central Park. The city stretched out beneath Alexander Sterling's feet like a conquered kingdom, 40 stories of glass and steel separating him from the world below. At 38, he had everything a man could want: a net worth that made Forbes headlines, a real estate empire spanning 3 continents, and a reputation that made other billionaires take notes. Alexander Sterling wasn't just wealthy, he was legendary. His morning routine was as precise as his business deals. Up at 4:47 a.m., 18 minutes of high-intensity training, protein shake made from ingredients that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and then straight into the war room they called his home office. By 6 a.m., he was already 3 moves ahead of markets that hadn't even opened yet. "Mr. Sterling," his assistant Marcus would brief him daily, "you have the Shanghai acquisition at 9, the London board meeting at 2, and my son's parent-teacher conference at 4, Alexander would interrupt, checking his Patek Philippe. "Move Shanghai to 10. London can wait." Because here's what people didn't understand about Alexander Sterling. Beneath the ruthless exterior, beneath the reputation that made grown executives sweat, there was one person who could stop him in his tracks with a single phone call: his 5-year-old son, James. James had his mother's eyes, bright blue like summer sky, and Alexander's stubborn determination. The boy was brilliant, reading chapter books before kindergarten, and asking questions that made philosophy professors pause. But more than that, James had something Alexander had forgotten he once possessed: an unguarded heart. 2 years ago, Alexander's world had imploded. Catherine, his wife, his anchor, his only soft place in a hard world, had been driving home from James's preschool graduation when a drunk driver ran a red light. The impact killed her instantly. Alexander remembered that day in fragments: the phone call that made his knees buckle, the hospital corridor that smelled like disinfectant and shattered dreams, and James's small voice asking, "When is Mommy coming home?" After the funeral, Alexander threw himself into work with the fury of a man trying to outrun grief. He bought companies, crushed competitors, and built an empire so vast that even sorrow couldn't find him in its depths. He told himself he was securing James's future, creating a legacy, being a responsible father. But late at night, when the markets closed and the phone stopped ringing, Alexander would stand in the doorway of his son's room, watching the boy sleep, and wonder if James even remembered what his voice sounded like. The Sterling penthouse was a machine of efficiency, run by a staff of 12 whose job it was to ensure that Alexander never had to worry about the mundane details of daily life. There was Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, who had been with the family since before James was born. Harold, the driver who knew every shortcut in Manhattan. Maria, the chef who could prepare 5-course meals for 200 guests with 6 hours' notice. And then there were the nannies. James had cycled through 7 nannies in 2 years, not because they were incompetent. Alexander only hired the best, but because something was missing. The boy was polite, well-behaved, academically advanced, but he carried himself like a small adult, shoulders slightly hunched, as if he were trying to take up less space in the world. He needs consistency, the child psychologist had explained. He needs someone who will be there, not just professionally, but emotionally available. Alexander had nodded and written another check, hired another expert, bought another solution. Because that's what he did. He solved problems by throwing resources at them until they disappeared. While Alexander conquered boardrooms, James lived in the carefully constructed bubble of privilege. His days were scheduled down to 15-minute increments. Piano lessons with a Juilliard graduate, French tutoring with a native speaker, swimming lessons at the private club, art classes with a teacher who'd exhibited at the Met. James excelled at everything, collected trophies and certificates like other children collected toys. But if you looked closely, if you had time to look closely, which Alexander rarely did, you might notice that James never smiled in any of the photos. The current nanny, Miss Wellington, was everything on paper that a billionaire would want for his son. Harvard-educated, multilingual, experienced with high-net-worth families. She treated James like a small adult, which everyone agreed was appropriate for such an advanced child. James is doing wonderfully, she would report to Alexander during their brief weekly meetings. His French is progressing beautifully, and his piano instructor says he has real talent. I do think, however, that we should consider adding Mandarin to his curriculum. It's never too early to prepare for the global marketplace. Alexander would nod and sign off on whatever Miss Wellington recommended. She was competent, professional, and completely unaware that James had started hiding in his bathroom to cry every night after she tucked him in with the emotional warmth of a handshake. But empires built on foundations of grief have a way of developing cracks, and in the Sterling household, those cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. James had stopped asking when Daddy would be home. He'd stopped running to the door when he heard Alexander's key in the lock. During their rushed breakfast meetings, the boy would answer his father's questions about school with polite one-word responses, his eyes focused on his organic steel-cut oats, as if they held the secrets of the universe. "How was school today, buddy?" "Fine." "What did you learn?" "Things." "Miss Wellington says you're doing great in piano." "Yes, sir." Yes, sir. Like Alexander was just another adult in a suit who happened to share James's last name. And late at night, when Alexander would finally come home from whatever deal had kept him at the office until midnight, he would hear something that made his chest tight. The sound of his son talking, not the polite, measured responses he gave adults, but real conversation, animated, excited, full of the kind of joy Alexander hadn't heard since Catherine died. But James wasn't talking to Miss Wellington. He wasn't talking to Mrs. Chen or any of the staff Alexander knew. He was talking to someone new, someone whose voice Alexander didn't recognize, but whose laughter seemed to unlock something in his son that had been locked away for 2 long years. 3 weeks before our story truly begins, Miss Wellington submitted her resignation with the kind of professional courtesy that barely masked her frustration. "Mr. Sterling," she said during their final meeting, "James is an exceptional child, but I feel he would benefit from a different approach, something less structured, perhaps. He seems to respond better to warmth than to achievement. Alexander had stared at her across his mahogany desk. This woman who had 3 degrees and spoke 5 languages, and wondered how she could have missed the point so completely. Miss Wellington, I'm not paying for warmth. I'm paying for results. James needs to be prepared for the world he's going to inherit. With respect, sir, he's 5 years old. Perhaps what he needs to inherit first is his childhood. Alexander had written her severance check and moved on to the next solution, because that's what he did. That's what had made him billions. Finding a replacement should have been simple. Alexander's assistant compiled a list of candidates that read like an academic who's who. Former professors, multilingual specialists, women with resumes that could intimidate graduate students. But James had developed what Mrs. Chen diplomatically called opinions about his caretakers. He's becoming quite selective, she explained to Alexander one morning. The lady from the Swiss boarding school background, he hid in the pantry for 3 hours. The one with a PhD in child psychology, he told her his favorite food was vegetables and then refused to speak for the rest of the interview. Alexander rubbed his temples. What does he want? Mrs. Chen smiled in the way that only someone who had raised children could. I think he wants someone who sees him, not just manages him. That's when Mrs. Chen made a suggestion that would change everything. My niece knows someone, she said carefully. A lovely woman, very gentle with children. She's between positions right now, but she has wonderful references, very experienced with little ones who have been through difficult times. Alexander barely looked up from his phone. Fine, set up the interview. Sir, there's one thing. That is to say, but Alexander was already on to the next crisis, the next deal, the next problem that required his immediate attention. Whatever, Mrs. Chen, if you trust her, that's enough for me. And so, without Alexander Sterling knowing anything more than her first name, Grace, a woman was hired to care for the most precious thing in his carefully constructed world. He never asked about her background, her qualifications, or her references. He never asked why she needed the job or where she had worked before. He signed the employment agreement that Marcus had prepared, authorized the salary that Mrs. Chen had suggested, and assumed that was the end of it. After all, how important could one employee be? Alexander Sterling was about to find out. 3 weeks later, as Alexander prepared for a business trip that would take him to London, Singapore, and Tokyo, Alexander kissed his son goodbye and made a promise he'd made 100 times before. I'll be back soon, buddy. Be good for Grace. James had nodded and said, Yes, Daddy. But for the first time in months, the boy was smiling. Alexander should have wondered why. He should have asked questions. He should have paid attention. But he was already thinking about the meetings ahead, the deals to close, the empire to expand. In 72 hours, he would return home to discover that sometimes the most important changes happen in the spaces we're not watching, in the moments we're not present, in the hands of people whose names we never bothered to learn. The kitchen was about to become the most important room in Alexander Sterling's world. He just didn't know it yet. The Gulfstream G650 touched down at Teterboro Airport at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday that had started in Tokyo and somehow stretched across 3 time zones and 4 board meetings. Alexander's body was running on adrenaline and espresso, but his mind was already calculating. If he left the airport by midnight, he could be home by 12:30, catch 4 hours of sleep, and still make his 7 a.m. meeting with the Deutsche Bank executives. The ride through Manhattan was a blur of neon and empty streets. Alexander's phone buzzed constantly. Singapore wanted to move up the timeline. London was having second thoughts about the merger terms. His lawyers needed signatures on documents that would reshape 3 companies by morning. But as the elevator carried him up 40 stories to his penthouse, something shifted in Alexander's chest. A feeling he hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation. Not for another deal or another victory, but for something simpler. He wanted to see his son. James would be asleep, of course. It was past midnight, but Alexander found himself thinking about the boy's face, about maybe sitting in that small chair beside James's bed for just a few minutes, watching him breathe, remembering what mattered beyond market cap and profit margins. The kitchen was dark, except for the soft glow coming from the kitchen. Alexander frowned. The staff knew better than to leave lights on unnecessarily. Mrs. Chen ran a tight ship, and waste, even something as small as an electric bill, was not tolerated in the Sterling household. Alexander loosened his tie and moved quietly toward the light, his Italian leather shoes silent on the marble floor. He expected to find Harold grabbing a late-night snack, or perhaps Mrs. Chen checking something for tomorrow's schedule. What he found instead stopped him cold. There, in his pristine, professional-grade kitchen that most nights stood empty like a museum exhibit, was a scene that belonged in a different world entirely. A woman sat at the kitchen island, not the formal dining area where James usually took his meals, but right there at the marble counter where Alexander sometimes grabbed coffee before rushing to the office. She was black, probably in her early 30s, with natural hair pulled back in a simple style that somehow made her look both professional and approachable. She wore jeans and a soft sweater, clothes that cost less than Alexander's watch, but fit her like they were made for exactly this moment. And curled against her side, his small body tucked perfectly into the curve of her arm, was James. Alexander's son, the boy who hadn't voluntarily touched another human being since his mother died, the child who shook hands with adults like a tiny businessman and said please and thank you with the formality of a diplomatic summit, was fast asleep with his head on this woman's shoulder. But that wasn't what made Alexander's breath catch in his throat. It was the way she was holding him. Grace. Because this had to be Grace, the woman Mrs. Chen had hired, had her arms wrapped around James in a way that was both protective and completely natural. Her chin rested gently on the top of his head, and even in sleep, her body curved around his like she was a harbor, and he was a small boat that had finally found safe waters. Alexander stood frozen in the doorway, his phone still buzzing in his pocket, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. When was the last time he had seen James look so peaceful? When was the last time his son had fallen asleep somewhere other than his own bed, in his own room, alone? Grace must have sensed his presence because she looked up, and Alexander found himself staring into the warmest brown eyes he had ever seen. There was no judgment there, no embarrassment at being caught, no hurried explanation or apology for overstepping boundaries. Instead, she smiled, soft and tired, but genuine, and whispered, "You must be Mr. Sterling. Welcome home." Her voice was like honey and music, with just a trace of the South that made every word sound like it came from somewhere kinder than the world Alexander knew. And when she spoke, James stirred slightly, but didn't wake, just pressed closer against her side with the trust of a child who had finally found exactly where he belonged. Alexander realized he was staring. More than that, he realized he didn't know what to say. In boardrooms, he commanded attention with a single glance. In negotiations, he could read people like profit and loss statements and find their pressure points within minutes. but standing in his own kitchen, looking at his son in the arms of a woman whose last name he didn't even know, Alexander Sterling was speechless. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered, starting to gently wake James. "We were reading and he had a long day, and I think he was more tired than either of us realized. I should have put him to bed hours ago." "No," Alexander said quickly, and his own voice sounded strange to his ears. Don't wake him." Because James looked happy, even in sleep, even at almost 1 a.m. in a kitchen that had never seen this kind of tenderness. His son looked happy. Grace shifted carefully, trying to stand without disturbing James, but the boy's small fists had tangled themselves in her sweater, and even unconscious, he seemed determined not to let go. Alexander watched this small struggle, his son clinging to this woman like she was a lifeline, and felt something crack open in his chest. "Here," Alexander said, stepping forward. "Let me—" But as soon as Alexander's hands touched James's shoulders, the boy stirred, and his eyes fluttered open. For just a moment, James looked around in confusion, at the kitchen, at his father, at the late hour. Then his gaze settled on Grace, and his whole face relaxed. "Grace," he mumbled, still half asleep, "did Daddy come home?" "Yes, baby," Grace said softly, her hand smoothing down James's hair in a gesture so natural, so maternal, that Alexander felt like he was watching something he had no right to witness. "Daddy's home." James turned to look at his father, and Alexander saw something in his son's eyes that he hadn't seen in 2 years. Excitement. Not the polite interest James showed when Alexander brought him expensive presents, but genuine joy. "Daddy, guess what Grace and I did today? We made cookies, and she taught me how to fold the dough just right, and then we read 3 whole chapters of Charlotte's Web, and she does all the voices differently, and Wilbur sounds just like I think a pig should sound like." The words tumbled out of James in a rush that made my throat tight. When was the last time his son had volunteered information? When was the last time his son had seemed excited to see him? "That sounds wonderful, buddy. But it's very late. You should be in bed." He expected James to nod and comply, to slip back into the quiet, obedient child who had replaced his vibrant son after Catherine died. Instead, James looked at Grace with an expression Alexander couldn't quite read. "Can Grace read one more chapter? She was just getting to the part where Charlotte explains about the egg sac, and I really want to know what happens." Alexander looked at Grace, expecting her to politely decline, to maintain professional boundaries, to recognize that it was well past appropriate bedtime and that her presence meant she should probably retreat to whatever quarters Mrs. Chen had arranged for her. Instead, Grace looked back at him with those warm brown eyes and said, "It's your call, Mr. Sterling, but we are at a pretty good cliffhanger." And that's how Alexander Sterling, a man who owned hotels in 17 countries, who had never been in his own kitchen past 10 p.m., who scheduled every moment of his life in 6-minute increments, found himself sitting at his marble kitchen counter at 1:23 a.m., listening to a woman he'd met 5 minutes ago read about a spider named Charlotte to a 5-year-old who hadn't been this animated since his mother died. Grace read with the kind of total commitment that made Alexander understand why James was so captivated. She became Charlotte, wise and gentle. She became Wilbur, innocent and worried. She became Templeton the rat, selfish but ultimately loyal. And James hung on every word, occasionally gasping or laughing or whispering questions that Grace answered without breaking the flow of the story. Alexander found himself listening too, not just to the story, but to the sound of his son's laughter, to the way Grace's voice rose and fell with the emotion of each character, to the easy conversation between them that felt more like family than anything that had happened in this house since Catherine died. "How long have you been working here?" Alexander asked, when Grace finished the chapter and James had finally agreed to go to bed. "3 weeks yesterday," Grace replied, helping James down from the counter. "Mrs. Chen has been very kind, helping me settle in." "And before that?" Grace paused, and Alexander saw something flicker across her face. Not secrecy exactly, but a kind of careful consideration. "I was between positions," she said simply. "Sometimes life takes you in directions you don't expect." Alexander nodded, though he didn't really understand. In his world, careers followed trajectories. People had 5-year plans and strategic objectives. They didn't end up in between positions unless something had gone wrong. But watching Grace say goodnight to James, watching his son hug her like she was the most precious thing in his world, Alexander found himself caring less about her resume and more about whatever magic she had worked in 3 weeks to bring his son back to life. Alexander's alarm went off at 4:47 a.m., just like always, but for the first time in months, he hit snooze. Not because he was tired, though 17 time zones in 4 days had certainly taken their toll, but because he couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen in the kitchen. The image kept playing in his mind like a film loop. James, completely at peace, curled against Grace like it was the most natural thing in the world. His son, who had been polite but distant with every nanny, every tutor, every adult in his life since Catherine died, had found someone who made him feel safe enough to fall asleep in her arms. When Alexander finally made it to the kitchen at 6:15, late by his standards, but still before most of the world was awake, he found Grace already there, quietly preparing breakfast. She wore a simple dress and apron, her movements efficient but unhurried, and the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and something Alexander couldn't identify but made him think of childhood mornings he'd forgotten he'd ever had. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," Grace said, looking up with that same warm smile. "I hope you slept well. I made extra coffee. Mrs. Chen mentioned you usually take it black." Alexander accepted the mug she offered, and the coffee was perfect. Not the bitter, burnt taste he was used to from the office machine, or the overly sweet concoctions his previous housekeepers had prepared. This tasted like coffee was supposed to taste, rich and warm and somehow comforting. "Where's James?" he asked. "Still sleeping," Grace replied. "He had a big day yesterday, and I thought he could use the extra rest. I'll wake him at 7:30 so he has plenty of time for breakfast before his piano lesson." Alexander nodded, but something nagged at him. What kind of big day? Miss Wellington never mentioned that James had particularly energetic days. Grace paused in her preparation of what looked like actual pancakes, not the protein-rich, nutritionally optimized breakfast substitute James usually ate, but real, fluffy pancakes that probably had 0 educational value and maximum happiness potential. "Well," Grace said carefully, "yesterday we went to the park, the real park, not just the private playground. James had never fed the ducks before, and he was so excited when they actually came up to eat the bread we brought. Then we came home and baked cookies, which led to a conversation about measurements and fractions that I think taught him more about math than any worksheet could have. And then we read and talked about friendship and loyalty and what it means to keep promises." She looked at Alexander directly, and he saw something in her eyes that made him uncomfortable. Not challenge, exactly, but a quiet confidence that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing and why. Miss Wellington had a very structured approach, but James is 5. He needs time to be curious, to explore, to just be a little boy. He's been carrying himself like he needs to be perfect all the time, and that's a heavy burden for such small shoulders. Alexander felt defensive, though he wasn't sure why. James has advantages that most children never get. The best education, the finest opportunities. Of course he does, and those are wonderful gifts. But he also has something else most children don't have. What's that? He has a father who loves him so much that he's afraid to let him be anything less than perfect. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He set down his coffee mug harder than he intended, and the sound echoed in the pristine kitchen. "I want the best for my son," he said stiffly. "I know you do," Grace replied, her voice gentle but unwavering. "But sometimes the best thing we can give a child isn't more lessons or higher expectations. Sometimes it's permission to be exactly who they are, right now, at this age, without having to earn our love by being exceptional." Alexander stared at this woman, this employee, he reminded himself, who had been in his house for 3 weeks and was now presuming to give him parenting advice. He should have been angry. He should have reminded her of professional boundaries and appropriate roles. Instead, he found himself asking, "Do you have children?" Something flickered across Grace's face. Pain, maybe, or loss. "No," she said quietly, "but I've cared for many children over the years, and I've learned that what they need most isn't what we think they need. It's what they show us they need, if we're paying attention." Just then, James appeared in the doorway, his hair sticking up in every direction, still in his pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes. But when he saw Grace, his whole face lit up. "Grace, did you make the pancakes with the faces like you promised?" "I sure did, baby," Grace said, and I watched her entire demeanor transform from the careful professionalism she showed him to something warmer, more natural. "Come see." James scrambled up onto one of the bar stools, and Grace placed a plate in front of him that made the boy gasp with delight. The pancake had a smiley face made from blueberries and banana slices, and James clapped his hands like he'd been given the greatest gift in the world. "Daddy, look!" James called, his excitement infectious. "Grace makes the best breakfast faces. Yesterday she made one that looked like a lion." Alexander looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw something that made his chest tight. James was glowing, not just happy, but radiant in a way Alexander hadn't seen since before Catherine died. His son was 5 years old and acting like a 5-year-old, delighting in silly pancake faces and talking with his mouth full and bouncing slightly in his chair with pure joy. When was the last time Alexander had seen James be truly, unselfishly happy? "That's wonderful, buddy," Alexander said, and his voice sounded strange even to himself. James beamed at him, then turned back to Grace. "Can we go to the park again today? I want to see if those same ducks remember us." "We'll see," Grace said, smoothing James's wild hair. "First, let's get some food in you and get you ready for piano." Alexander watched this interaction, gentle, natural, full of the kind of easy affection he remembered from his own childhood, but had somehow forgotten how to give, and felt like he was seeing his son clearly for the first time in 2 years. The revelation. As Alexander left for the office that morning, his mind wasn't on the Deutsche Bank meeting or the Singapore acquisition. Instead, he found himself thinking about a question Grace had asked. When was the last time you just sat with James without trying to teach him something or improve him somehow? Alexander couldn't remember. Worse, he was starting to realize that in his desperate attempt to give James the best of everything, he might have forgotten to give him the one thing that mattered most, a father who was present, not just providing. And this woman, this Grace, whose last name he still didn't know, whose qualifications he'd never bothered to check, had somehow understood his son in 3 weeks better than he had in 2 years. That should have been impossible. That should have been insulting. Instead, as Alexander sat in traffic heading toward another day of billion-dollar decisions, he found himself wondering, what else had he missed? What else had he gotten wrong? And how was it possible that a woman he'd hired sight unseen had become the person his son trusted most in the world? The questions followed him into every meeting that day, gnawing at the edges of his concentration, making him wonder for the first time if the empire he'd built for James was worth anything if he'd lost his son in the process of building it. That evening, Alexander Sterling made a decision that would have shocked everyone who knew him. He canceled his dinner meeting with the Tokyo investors and went home early. He wanted to see his son. But more than that, he wanted to understand what Grace saw that he had missed. He wanted to learn what she knew that he didn't. He had no idea that his entire world was about to change. At 4:17 p.m. on a Wednesday that should have ended with dinner at Le Bernardin and handshake deals worth more than most people's lifetime earnings, Alexander Sterling did something that made his assistant Marcus question whether his boss was having some kind of breakdown. He left the office early. Not just early, catastrophically early by Sterling standards. The sun was still shining. People were still commuting home from normal jobs. Alexander had canceled 3 meetings, postponed a conference call with investors in Hong Kong, and walked out of his corner office while his phone was still ringing with urgent matters that supposedly couldn't wait until tomorrow. "Sir," Marcus had called after him, clutching a stack of documents that needed signatures, "the Yamamoto Group is expecting your decision by midnight Tokyo time, and the contracts for the Berlin property acquisition." "Handle it," Alexander had said, pressing the elevator button with more force than necessary. "Or don't. The world will not end if Alexander Sterling doesn't sign a piece of paper today." Marcus stared at him like he'd announced he was joining the circus. But as Alexander's car navigated through Manhattan traffic that for once he wasn't trying to beat, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, anticipation for something other than profit margins. He wanted to get home before James's bedtime. He wanted to sit in that kitchen again and watch his son's face light up. He wanted to understand what Grace was doing that made such a difference. Alexander walked into his penthouse at 5:43 p.m., a time so unprecedented that Harold, who had driven for the Sterling family for 8 years, asked twice if they were going back out that evening. The smell hit him first, something warm and savory and completely unlike anything that had ever come out of his designer kitchen, not the carefully planned, nutritionally optimized meals that Maria usually prepared, but something that smelled like home. Like the kind of home Alexander remembered from childhood visits to his grandmother's house, before life became about quarterly reports and market domination. He followed the scent and the sound of laughter, actual laughter, bright and unrestrained, to find a scene that stopped him in the doorway. Grace stood at the stove, wearing an apron over her simple dress, stirring something in a cast-iron pot that Alexander was pretty sure had never been used in his kitchen before. Her hair was slightly messed from cooking, and there was flour on her cheek, and she looked more beautiful than any of the perfectly polished women Alexander had dated since Catherine died. But it was James that made Alexander's breath catch. His son sat at the kitchen island on a bar stool that had been pulled close to the action, sleeves rolled up, completely absorbed in kneading what looked like bread dough. His small hands worked the dough with intense concentration, and every few minutes he would look up at Grace and ask a question that made her smile and explain something that made him nod seriously before returning to his task. "Is it supposed to feel this squishy?" "That's exactly how it's supposed to feel. You're doing perfect, baby. See how it's getting smoother? That's the gluten developing. You're making magic happen." James beamed at the word magic and pressed his palms into the dough with renewed enthusiasm. "I'm making magic, Daddy! Grace is teaching me how to make real bread, not the kind from the store, but the kind where you have to wait for it to grow." "Rise," Grace corrected gently. "The bread rises because of the yeast." "Right! The bread rises because the yeast are like tiny little animals that eat sugar and burp out bubbles, and the bubbles make the bread fluffy." Alexander found himself smiling at his son's delighted explanation. "That sounds scientifically accurate." "Grace makes everything make sense," James said seriously. "She knows why bread gets fluffy, and why the sky is blue, and why some flowers only open at night. She's like a library, but more fun." Grace laughed, and the sound made something warm unfurl in Alexander's chest. "What are you making?" Alexander asked, stepping into the kitchen properly.
"Chicken and dumplings," Grace replied. "James mentioned he'd never had them, and I thought, well, it seemed like a good day for comfort food." Chicken and dumplings. Alexander couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten anything that wasn't either professionally prepared by a chef or grabbed hastily between meetings. The idea of comfort food seemed foreign, almost quaint. "Can Daddy eat with us?" James asked Grace, and there was something in his son's voice, hope maybe, or excitement at the novelty, that made Alexander realize how rarely they shared meals together anymore. "Of course he can," Grace said, glancing at Alexander. "If he wants to. Though I should warn you, this isn't exactly five-star restaurant food." "It smells better than five-star restaurant food," Alexander said truthfully. They ate at the kitchen island, not the formal dining room with its mahogany table that seated 12 and its crystal chandelier that had been featured in Architectural Digest. Just the three of them, sitting on bar stools around the marble counter, eating Grace's chicken and dumplings out of everyday bowls while James chattered about his day. "And then Grace showed me how to make the dumplings fluffy by not stirring them too much. She said cooking is like science, but also like art, because you have to feel when it's right." Alexander found himself watching Grace as much as listening to James. She ate with unself-conscious pleasure, occasionally wiping James's face or cutting his dumpling into smaller pieces, participating in the conversation, but also just present. There was something peaceful about her that Alexander couldn't identify, something that made the space around her feel calmer, safer. "Grace tells the best stories," James announced. "Yesterday she told me about when she was little and her grandmother taught her to make biscuits from scratch, and how her grandmother said that biscuits made with love taste different than biscuits made just because you're hungry." "Do you think that's true?" Alexander asked his son. James considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher. "I think so, because Grace's food tastes like hugs." Alexander looked at Grace and saw her smile, but also something else, a flicker of sadness maybe, or nostalgia. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman," he said. "She was," Grace replied softly. "She raised me after my parents died. Everything I know about taking care of people, I learned from her." "I'm sorry," Alexander said automatically. "About your parents?" "Thank you. I was young, so I don't remember them much. But Grandma Clara, she made sure I knew I was loved every single day until she passed when I was 18. James had gone quiet, listening with the intensity children bring to adult conversations that touch on things they're trying to understand. "Is that why you're so good at taking care of people? Because your grandma taught you?" "I think so, baby. She used to say that love isn't something you feel, it's something you do, every day, in little ways." Alexander felt something twist in his chest at those words. Love isn't something you feel, it's something you do? When was the last time he had done love for James, rather than just providing for him? After dinner, after James had helped Grace clean the dishes and been allowed to stay up an extra 30 minutes to finish the bread they'd made earlier, after Alexander had found himself laughing at his son's impression of the ducks they'd fed at the park, Grace asked a question that stopped Alexander cold. "Mr. Sterling?" she said quietly, as they watched James carefully butter a slice of the still warm bread. "Can I ask you something?" Alexander nodded. "When was the last time you played with James? Not educational play, not structured activities, but just played." Alexander opened his mouth to answer and realized he couldn't. He could list a dozen activities they'd done together, piano recitals he'd attended, museum visits they'd made, educational games they'd completed. But play? Pure, purposeless, joyful play? Alexander started, then stopped. "We do lots of activities together." "I know you do," Grace said gently, "and that's wonderful. James is so proud when he tells me about the places you take him and the things you teach him. But I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about getting on the floor and building block towers just to knock them down, playing hide and seek where the only goal is to hear him giggle, making up silly songs that don't teach anything except that it's okay to be ridiculous sometimes." Alexander felt defensive. James is exceptionally bright. He benefits from intellectual stimulation. He absolutely does, Grace agreed. But he's also 5, and 5-year-olds need to know it's safe to be silly. They need to know they're loved, not because they're smart or well-behaved or accomplished, but just because they exist. "I love my son," Alexander said, stiffly. "I know you do," Grace replied, and her voice held no judgment, only kindness. "But love and fear can sometimes look really similar from the outside." "Fear?" Alexander's voice was sharper than he intended. Grace glanced at James, who was absorbed in eating his bread and humming to himself, then looked back at Alexander. "You're afraid of losing him after what happened to his mother. You're terrified that if you're not perfect, if you don't give him every advantage, if you don't prepare him for every possible challenge, something terrible will happen." Alexander felt like she had reached into his chest and grabbed his heart. "That's not... So you schedule every moment of his day. You hire the best tutors and the most qualified nannies. You make sure he's learning and achieving and becoming the kind of person who can handle anything life throws at him." Grace's voice was gentle, but her words cut deep. "But in trying so hard to protect him from the world, you've forgotten to let him be a child in it." The silence that followed was heavy with truth Alexander wasn't sure he was ready to face. "He misses you," Grace said finally. "Not your presence. He sees you plenty. He misses knowing you. He misses feeling like he can disappoint you and still be loved. He misses having a daddy who's not afraid to get silly with him." Alexander looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw what Grace meant. Even now, happily eating bread and humming to himself, James carried himself with a careful precision that belonged on a much older person. When had his 5-year-old learned to be so cautious? "I don't know how," Alexander said quietly. "I don't know how to be the kind of father you're describing." "That's okay," Grace then smiled, warm and encouraging. "Neither of the rest of us did when we started. But James does. Children are excellent teachers if we're willing to be students." Alexander came home at 6 p.m. again, which made 2 unprecedented early arrivals in 2 days. Marcus had stopped asking questions and started looking genuinely concerned for his boss's mental health. But Alexander was beginning to understand something he'd forgotten in the years since Catherine died. Work would always be there. Deals would always need making. Money would always need earning. But James was 5 years old right now, today, and he would never be 5 years old again. This time, Alexander found them in the living room, a space that had been professionally decorated but rarely used, all cream-colored furniture and carefully arranged coffee table books that no one actually read. Grace and James had built what appeared to be the world's most elaborate blanket fort, using couch cushions, dining room chairs, and what looked like every pillow in the apartment. James was inside the fort, flashlight in hand, reading aloud to an audience of stuffed animals that Alexander hadn't seen in months. "And Charlotte said to Wilbur," James was reading in his most dramatic voice, "I am your friend. That in itself is a tremendous thing." Grace sat cross-legged on the floor outside the fort, listening with the kind of complete attention that James' performance something special. When he finished the passage, she clapped enthusiastically. "That was beautiful, baby. You read that with so much feeling. Charlotte really is a good friend, isn't she?" "The best friend," James agreed solemnly. "She saves Wilbur even though she's just a spider and he's a pig and they're supposed to be different." What do you think that teaches us? Grace asked. James thought for a moment, with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice. That friends don't have to be the same to love each other. That's exactly right, Grace said, and Alexander heard something in her voice, pride, but also something deeper, something that suggested this conversation meant more to her than James could understand. Alexander cleared his throat, and both Grace and James looked up. Daddy, look what Grace and I built. It's a reading castle, and I'm the king, and Grace is my royal advisor, and we're having a meeting about important kingdom business. I can see that, Alexander said, looking around at the chaos that had transformed his pristine living room. A week ago, this would have horrified him. Now he found himself thinking it looked alive. What kind of important kingdom business? We're deciding what story to read next, James said seriously. Grace says a good king always gets advice before making important decisions. Alexander looked at Grace, who was watching this interaction with an expression he couldn't quite read. That sounds like very wise advice. Would you like to join our royal council? James asked, and there was hope in his voice that made Alexander's chest tight. Alexander looked at his expensive suit, at the blanket fort that would require him to crawl on the floor, and at his son's expectant face. 6 months ago, he would have suggested they clean up and move to somewhere more appropriate for adult conversation. Instead, he loosened his tie and got down on his hands and knees. "It would be an honor, Your Majesty," he said, crawling into the blanket fort. The next hour passed in a way Alexander couldn't have imagined. They read 3 chapters of Charlotte Webb, with James insisting that Alexander voice Templeton, the rat, because you have a good sneaky voice, Daddy. They discussed the important philosophical questions that E.B. White raises about friendship and loyalty and what it means to be useful in the world. They ate graham crackers and drank milk from regular glasses, not the organic, locally sourced alternatives that usually appeared on James's nutritional plan. And Alexander found himself laughing, really laughing, at his son's observations about pig psychology and his dramatic interpretations of barnyard politics. When was the last time he had laughed like this? When was the last time he had forgotten about everything except the moment he was in? Later, after James had been convinced to abandon the blanket fort and go to bed, though not without extracting promises that the fort would still be there tomorrow, Alexander found Grace cleaning up the living room with efficient, quiet movements. "Leave it," he said. "The housekeeping staff will handle it in the morning." Grace paused, a throw pillow in her hands. "I don't mind. I like putting things back in order." Alexander watched her work, noting the care she took with each item, the way she folded the blankets exactly as they had been, the respect she showed for possessions that weren't hers. "Grace," he said, "can I ask you something?" She looked up, waiting. "Where did you work before this? Mrs. Chen mentioned you came with excellent references, but I realized I never actually saw them." Something flickered across Grace's face. Not fear exactly, but a kind of careful consideration. "I worked for a family in Connecticut," she said finally, "taking care of their children." "For how long?" 3 years. Grace set down the pillow she had been holding. "Mr. Sterling, is there something specific you'd like to know?" Alexander hesitated. He could push for details, demand references, conduct the kind of background check he should have done before hiring her. But watching Grace with James, seeing the transformation in his son, he found that the specifics of her resume mattered less than the results. "Just, thank you," he said instead. "Whatever you're doing, however you learned it, thank you. I haven't seen James this happy since his mother died." Grace's expression softened. "He's a wonderful boy, Mr. Sterling. He just needed permission to be one." "Alex," he said impulsively. "My name is Alex." Grace smiled. "Alex." The way she said his name, not with the deference he was used to from employees, not with the calculation he heard from business associates, but with something warmer, something that made him feel like a person rather than a position, made Alexander realize how long it had been since someone had simply said his name and made it sound like something worth saying. "Grace," he said, "would you like to have dinner with us tomorrow? Not just feeding James, but actually joining us for a meal." "I would like that very much." And as Alexander went to bed that night, after checking in on James and finding his son sleeping with a smile on his face, after walking through a living room that still smelled faintly of graham crackers and childhood, he realized that for the first time in 2 years, he was looking forward to coming home. He was looking forward to seeing his son, and if he was being completely honest with himself, he was looking forward to seeing Grace too. Tomorrow, he would make another unprecedented decision. He would work from home. Alexander woke up at 4:47 a.m. just like always, but instead of heading to the gym and then the office, he did something that would have sent shockwaves through Sterling Industries if anyone had known. He made coffee in his own kitchen and sat at the counter where he had watched his son eat pancake faces, and he worked from home.
The emails piled up. Marcus called 6 times before 8 a.m. The Singapore deal needed attention. The London acquisition was getting complicated, and 3 different department heads needed decisions that apparently only Alexander could make. But at 7:30 a.m., Alexander heard something that made him close his laptop and forget about international markets entirely. The sound of his son giggling. Real giggling. The kind of helpless, joyful laughter that comes from deep in a child's belly and bubbles up like a spring. Alexander followed the sound to James's bedroom, where he found a scene that belonged in a movie about perfect childhoods. Grace sat cross-legged on the floor, while James stood behind her, carefully braiding sections of her hair with the intense concentration of a surgeon performing a critical operation. "Hold still, Grace," James commanded. "This is very important work. I'm making you beautiful for the day." "I'm trying, baby," Grace replied, though Alexander could see she was shaking slightly with suppressed laughter. "But your fingers are so tickly." "Daddy," James spotted Alexander in the doorway. "Look, Grace is teaching me how to braid hair. She says it's like weaving, but with people, and that lots of cultures have special meanings for how they do braids, and that in some places, the way you braid your hair tells stories about who you are." Alexander looked at Grace, whose hair was now a masterpiece of 5-year-old creativity. Multiple small braids sticking out at odd angles, some secured with rubber bands, others already coming undone, the whole effect somehow managing to be both completely ridiculous and utterly charming. "That's quite a hairstyle," Alexander said. Grace laughed, reaching up to touch one of the more ambitious braids. "James is a very creative stylist. I may start a new trend." "You look beautiful, Grace," James said with the absolute sincerity that only children possess. "Even more beautiful than regular, and you're already the most beautiful person I know, except for Mommy, but Mommy is in heaven, so you're the most beautiful person I know on earth." Alexander felt his breath catch at the casual way James mentioned Catherine, not with the careful sadness that had characterized any mention of his mother for the past 2 years, but with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had processed his grief and found a way to carry his love forward. "Thank you, sweetheart," Grace said softly, and Alexander saw tears in her eyes that she was trying not to let James see. "That's the most wonderful compliment anyone has ever given me." The moment was interrupted by Alexander's phone buzzing with yet another urgent call. This time it was Mrs. Chen calling from the lobby with a tone of barely controlled panic. "Mr. Sterling, I am so sorry to bother you, but there's a woman here asking for Grace. She says she's from social services and she has some kind of official paperwork. She's asking to speak with Grace immediately." Alexander felt ice form in his stomach. Social services didn't make casual visits. They came when something was wrong, when someone had made a complaint, when children were in danger. "I'll be right down," he said. "What is it?"
Grace asked, and Alexander noticed that she had gone very still, her hands frozen in the process of trying to tame James's handiwork in her hair. "Someone from social services is here to see you," Alexander said, watching Grace's face carefully. The color drained from Grace's cheeks, and for just a moment, Alexander saw something that looked like fear. Not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, like she had been expecting this, but hoping it wouldn't come. "Grace?" James looked between the two adults, sensing the sudden tension. "What's wrong? What's social services?" "It's nothing, baby," Grace said quickly, but her voice was tight. "Just some people who need to ask me some questions. Why don't you go pick out what you want to wear today while I talk to them?" James hesitated, clearly sensing that something was not nothing. But Grace's smile, even strained as it was enough to convince him to head to his closet. "Grace," Alexander said quietly, "is there something I should know?" Grace looked at him for a long moment, and Alexander saw her weighing options, making calculations he couldn't follow. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Complicated how?" "Mr. Sterling, Alex, I need to ask you for a favor. Can you trust me, just for a little while longer? Can you let me handle this my way?" Alexander studied her face. Everything in his business training told him to demand answers, to protect his interests, to find out what kind of liability he might be facing by having this woman in his home with his son. But something else, something that had nothing to do with legal protections, and everything about the way James had laughed this morning, made him nod. "Okay," he said. "But Grace, if this affects James in any way—" "It won't," Grace said, with a certainty that almost fierce. "I promise you, Alex, whatever happens, I will never let anything hurt James." The woman waiting in the Sterling Building's marble lobby looked exactly like what casting would order for a social worker. Mid-40s, sensible shoes, clipboard, and the kind of expression that suggested she had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. "Miss Washington?" she said, as Grace approached, Alexander a step behind. "I'm Linda Morrison from Child Protective Services. I need to speak with you about your current employment situation." "Of course," Grace said, her voice steady but formal, completely different from the warm, musical tone Alexander had grown used to. "What can I help you with?" "There's been a complaint filed regarding your current position. Allegations that you're working under false pretenses, that you've misrepresented your qualifications and background to gain access to a minor child." Alexander felt his protective instincts flare. "Excuse me," he said, stepping forward. "I'm Alexander Sterling, Grace's employer. What exactly are you suggesting?" Linda Morrison looked Alexander up and down, clearly cataloging the expensive suit, the confident posture, the unmistakable aura of wealth and power. "Mr. Sterling, are you aware of Miss Washington's employment history?" "I have references," Alexander began. "References that may not tell the complete story. Mr. Sterling, did you know that Miss Washington was terminated from her previous position? Did you know that there were allegations of inappropriate conduct with the children in her care?" The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He looked at Grace, expecting to see denial, outrage, some indication that this was a misunderstanding or a malicious lie. Instead, he saw resignation. "Grace," he said quietly. "It's not what it sounds like," Grace said, but her voice was barely above a whisper. "Miss Washington was accused of overstepping boundaries with her employer's children, getting too emotionally involved, undermining parental authority, filling the children's heads with inappropriate ideas about their family situation."
"That's not—" Grace started, then stopped herself. "Mr. Sterling, could we perhaps discuss this privately?" "I think we're past private discussions," Alexander said, and he could hear his own voice getting colder, more distant. "I think I need to hear what Miss Morrison has to say." Morrison flipped through her papers. "Miss Washington was employed by the Hartwell family in Greenwich for 3 years.
During that time, she allegedly encouraged the children to keep secrets from their parents, spoke inappropriately about the family's personal matters, and was ultimately terminated when the youngest child, a 4-year-old, told his parents that Grace says Daddy doesn't really love us, he just loves his work. Alexander felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The words hit too close to home, resonated too perfectly with conversations he'd had with Grace about his own parenting. Had she been manipulating him? Had everything he'd witnessed been some kind of performance? Furthermore, Morrison continued, there are questions about Miss Washington's living situation, her legal status, and whether she's been entirely truthful about her personal circumstances. What does that mean? Alexander asked. Miss Morrison looked at Grace. Would you like to tell him, Miss Washington, or should I? Grace closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, Alexander saw something that made his chest tight. Not guilt, exactly, but a deep sadness that seemed to go back much further than this conversation. My name is Grace Washington. That much is true. I did work for the Hartwell family for 3 years. I did care for their children. And, Alexander prompted, and I was fired because I couldn't stand by and watch what they were doing to those kids. Grace's voice got stronger, more defiant. Michael Hartwell worked 18-hour days, came home drunk half the time, screamed at his wife in front of the children, and hadn't had a real conversation with his son or daughter in months. His wife spent her days shopping and gossiping and popping pills to cope with her perfect life. Grace looked directly at Alexander. Those children were being raised by a rotating cast of nannies and tutors and drivers, just like... She stopped herself. Just like James, Alexander finished. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Alexander felt something cold spreading through his chest. So you decided to fix the situation. I decided to love those children, Grace said fiercely. I decided to be the one adult in their lives who saw them as people instead of projects. I decided to listen when they told me they were scared, when they said they felt invisible, when they asked me why their parents didn't seem to like them very much. And you told them their father didn't love them? Grace's shoulders sagged. Tommy, the 4-year-old, asked me why his daddy never came to his soccer games, why he never read him stories, why he only talked to him about school and grades and achievements. I told him that some parents love their children but don't know how to show it. I told him that sometimes when people are sad or scared, they focus on work instead of the people they love because work feels safer. Alexander felt like he was looking in a mirror he didn't want to see. Tommy asked me if that meant his daddy didn't really love him, and I said that love is something you do, not just something you feel, and that maybe his daddy needed to learn how to do love better. Jesus, Alexander breathed. Mrs. Hartwell overheard. She decided I was poisoning her children against their parents. She fired me that day and made sure I wouldn't get references good enough to work with families like theirs again. Miss Morrison cleared her throat. There's more, Mr. Sterling. Miss Washington has been living in transitional housing since her termination. She has no permanent address, no family support system, and limited resources. She accepted this position under circumstances that some might consider desperate. Alexander looked at Grace, really looked at her, and saw something he'd missed before. The careful way she treated his possessions, the gratitude in her eyes when he offered her dinner, the fact that she'd never mentioned her own life, her own needs, her own story. You're homeless, he said. Grace lifted her chin with a dignity that was heartbreaking. I prefer between situations. Miss Morrison closed her clipboard with the finality of a judge's gavel. Mr. Sterling, given Miss Washington's history and current circumstances, I strongly recommend that you terminate her employment immediately. There are serious questions about her judgment, her methods, and her motivations. Alexander felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him,
Everything Miss Morrison was saying made sense from a legal standpoint, from a protective father standpoint, from a responsible employer standpoint. Grace had been deceptive about her circumstances. She had been fired from her previous job for overstepping boundaries. She had inserted herself into family dynamics in ways that could be seen as manipulative. But then he thought about James's laughter this morning. He thought about his son falling asleep in Grace's arms, about the way James's whole face lit up when he saw her, about the first time in 2 years that his child had seemed truly, unselfconsciously happy. "Miss Morrison," Alexander said slowly, "what exactly are you recommending?" "Immediate termination, full background check on any future child care providers, and frankly, Mr. Sterling, you might want to consider having your son evaluated by a child psychologist to make sure there hasn't been any inappropriate influence." Alexander looked at Grace, who had gone very pale but was standing with her shoulders straight, her chin up as if she were facing a firing squad with dignity intact. "Grace," he said quietly, "is everything Miss Morrison said accurate? About my employment history, yes. About my living situation, yes. About my motivations, that's for you to judge. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have hired me if you'd known a homeless woman who was fired from her last job for getting too attached to the children she cared for?" Grace smiled sadly. "Men like you don't usually take chances on people like me, Alex. You take calculated risks on sure things." Alexander felt the truth of that statement like a slap. She was right. If he'd known her real situation, her real history, he never would have given her a chance. He would have moved on to the next candidate, the next safe choice, the next person who looked good on paper and checked all the boxes. "Miss Morrison," Alexander said slowly, "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, but I need to ask, has Grace been accused of harming any child in her care?" "Well, no, but has she been accused of theft, dishonesty about anything other than her personal circumstances, or any form of abuse or neglect?" "Mr. Sterling, you're missing the point." "No, I think I'm finally getting the point." Alexander looked at Grace, then back at Morrison. "Ms. Morrison, Grace works for me. My son is my responsibility, and based on what I've observed over the past 3 weeks, Grace is the best thing that's happened to my family since my wife died." Morrison's eyebrows shot up. "Mr. Sterling, I strongly advise—" "Ms. Morrison," Alexander interrupted, his voice taking on the tone that made board members sit up straight. "I want to know who filed this complaint." Morrison hesitated. "That information is confidential. Nothing is confidential when it comes to my son's welfare. Who called you?" Morrison consulted her clipboard reluctantly. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. She said she was concerned about the welfare of the child in Ms. Washington's current care." Alexander felt a surge of anger so pure it was almost cleansing. "Let me guess. Mrs. Hartwell heard through social circles that Grace was working for me, and she decided to make trouble. This isn't about child welfare, Ms. Morrison. This is about revenge." "That may be true, but the concerns raised are still valid." "Are they?" Alexander stepped closer to Morrison, using every inch of his height and every ounce of his presence. "Because here's what I know about Grace's work with my family. My son has gone from being a quiet, withdrawn child who barely spoke to me to a happy, engaged little boy who runs to greet me when I come home. He's learning, he's laughing, he's comfortable enough to be silly and curious and 5 years old. In 3 weeks, Grace has accomplished what 7 previous nannies and 3 child psychologists couldn't manage in 2 years." Alexander looked at Grace, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. "So here's what's going to happen. Grace is going to continue working for my family. I'm going to make sure she has appropriate housing, not transitional, not temporary, but a real home where she feels safe and secure. And if Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell or anyone else has a problem with that, they can take it up with my legal team." Ms. Morrison looked between Alexander and Grace, clearly recognizing that she was outgunned. "Mr. Sterling, I have to file a report."
File whatever report you want, but include in that report that James Sterling is a happy, healthy, well-cared-for child who is flourishing under Grace's care. Include that his father has never been more involved in his life, and include that any further harassment of my employee will be met with the full force of Sterling Industries' legal department." Ms. Morrison packed up her clipboard and left without another word. Alexander and Grace stood in the marble lobby for a long moment, the silence heavy with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. "Thank you," Grace said finally. "Don't thank me yet. We need to talk, really talk. No more secrets, no more half-truths. If you're going to be part of James's life, I need to know who you are, all of it." Grace nodded. "You're right." "But Grace," Alexander said, stopping her as she turned toward the elevator, "what I said up there about you being the best thing that's happened to my family, I meant that. Whatever else is true, whatever else we need to work through, that part is absolutely true." Grace's smile was like sunrise after a long, dark night. "Now," Alexander said, pressing the elevator button, "let's go home. I think James is probably wondering where we are." As they rode up 40 stories to the penthouse where a 5-year-old boy was waiting, Alexander realized that, for the first time since Catherine died, he wasn't afraid of the future, because he was starting to understand that the best things in life, love, trust, family, weren't about having all the answers or avoiding all the risks. They were about choosing the right people and holding on tight. That evening, after James had been fed, bathed, read to, and tucked into bed with promises that the blanket fort would remain untouched for at least one more day, Alexander and Grace sat across from each other at the kitchen island where this whole transformation had begun. Grace had made tea, real tea, not the expensive blends Alexander usually drank, but something simple and comforting that tasted like honesty. Her hands wrapped around the mug like she was trying to absorb its warmth, and I noticed that she was no longer wearing the careful mask of professional competence I'd grown used to seeing from his employees. "Ask me anything," Grace said quietly. "No more half-truths, no more evasion. You deserve to know who's been caring for your son." Alexander studied her face, the soft brown eyes that had made James feel safe, the mouth that had read countless stories and sung lullabies and somehow convinced a broken little boy that the world could be kind again. He had 100 questions, but only one seemed to matter. "Who are you, Grace? Really?" Grace was quiet for so long that Alexander began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm someone who wanted children so badly that I made a career out of loving other people's babies. I'm someone who spent 15 years taking care of families, watching kids grow up, and then having to say goodbye when they didn't need me anymore." She looked up at Alexander, and he saw a pain in her eyes that went deeper than job loss or temporary homelessness. "I'm someone who got married at 22 to a man who promised me we'd have a house full of children, and then spent 8 years trying to get pregnant, while he grew more distant and more resentful with every negative test, every failed treatment, every reminder that I couldn't give him what he wanted most." Alexander felt his chest tighten. "Grace, I'm someone who finally got pregnant at 31, after years of fertility treatments and prayers and hope. And I'm someone who lost that baby at 7 months, and then lost her marriage 6 months later when her husband decided that maybe they just weren't meant to be parents together." The silence that followed was heavy with grief that had clearly never been fully processed, never been properly mourned. That's when I started working for families. I told myself it was temporary, just until I figured out what came next. But the truth is, caring for other people's children was the closest I could get to the life I'd always dreamed of. For a few years at a time, I could pretend I belonged somewhere, that I was part of a family. I understood now why Grace moved through his home with such gratitude, why she treated every moment with James like it was precious, and why she had been so devastated by the thought of losing this position. "The Hartwells," Grace continued, They hired me when Tommy was 18 months old and Emma was 3. I watched them take their first steps, heard their first words, celebrated every milestone. But Michael and Patricia, they were so caught up in their own lives, their own problems, that they were missing everything beautiful about their children.
Grace's hands tightened around her mug. I tried to stay professional. I tried to just do my job and not get involved. But how do you watch a little boy cry himself to sleep because his daddy missed another soccer game? How do you see a little girl practice piano for hours because she thinks maybe if she's good enough, Mommy will pay attention to her? So you got involved, Alexander said. I loved them, Grace said simply. I couldn't help it. I loved them like they were mine, and I wanted them to know they were worth loving. I wanted them to understand that they deserved better than parents who were too busy, too selfish, too caught up in their own drama to see how incredible their children were. Alexander felt uncomfortable recognition stirring in his chest, and that's when you crossed the line. That's when I told the truth, Grace corrected. When Tommy asked me why his parents didn't seem to enjoy being around him, I didn't give him some diplomatic non-answer. I told him that some people don't know how to show love, but that doesn't mean the love isn't there. When Emma asked me if she was the reason her parents fought so much, I told her that grown-up problems are never children's fault. Grace looked directly at Alexander. And when they asked me if their parents loved them, I told them that love is something you do every day in little ways, and that they deserve to feel loved every single day of their lives. The Hartwells didn't appreciate that perspective, Alexander said dryly. Patricia accused me of poisoning her children against her. She said I was trying to replace her, that I was getting the kids too attached to me on purpose. She fired me and made sure I wouldn't work for any family in her social circle again. Grace's smile was bitter. The irony is that she was right about one thing. I was too attached. I loved Tommy and Emma like they were my own children, and losing them, it felt like losing my family all over again. Alexander absorbed this information, understanding now why Grace had been so hesitant to share her story. From the outside, her history could easily be interpreted as that of a woman who didn't respect boundaries, who manipulated children's emotions, who overstepped her role in dangerous ways. But from the inside, from the perspective of someone who had watched his own son retreat from the world after losing his mother, who had seen how James responded to Grace's particular brand of care, the story looked very different. "Where have you been living?" Alexander asked gently. "A women's shelter in Queens. It's temporary housing for women in transition. They allow you to stay for up to 6 months while you look for work and try to get back on your feet." Alexander thought about the commute from Queens to his Upper East Side penthouse, about Grace making that journey every day while working for him, never complaining, never asking for help. "How did you find out about the position here?" "Mrs. Chen's niece volunteers at the shelter. She mentioned that Mrs. Chen was looking for someone to help with a little boy who had lost his mama. She said the family was struggling with connection." Grace's smile was sad but genuine. "I almost didn't apply. After what happened with the Hartwells, I wasn't sure I could trust myself not to get too invested again. But then I thought about a 5-year-old who had lost his mama, and I knew I had to try. Even though it meant risking getting attached again, especially because it meant getting attached again. Alex, children who are grieving, who are lonely, who feel invisible, they don't need professional distance. They need to know that someone sees them, someone delights in who they are, someone thinks they're worth fighting for." Alexander felt the truth of that statement settle into his bones. James had needed exactly what Grace described, and somehow this woman, with her own broken heart, her own losses, her own desperate circumstances, had been able to give it to him. "Grace," Alexander said carefully, "what you did for James, the way you've loved him, that's not professional childcare. That's mothering." Grace's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back all evening. "I know," she whispered, "and I know that's dangerous. I know I can't keep him. I know this is temporary, just like it always is. But for right now, for as long as you'll let me, I want to love him like he deserves to be loved."
Alexander looked at this woman, this Grace who had been honest about her brokenness, who had chosen vulnerability over self-protection, who had loved James back to life despite knowing it would cost her heart again, and realized that everything in his world had just shifted. Because he wasn't just grateful to Grace for what she'd done for James, he was falling in love with her. Alexander Sterling had built an empire by calculating risk versus reward, by making decisions based on data and projections and careful analysis of potential outcomes. He had never, not once in his adult life, made a major decision based purely on how something felt. But sitting in his kitchen at 11 p.m., looking at Grace Washington as she wiped tears from her eyes and prepared to apologize again for caring too much about his son, Alexander found himself facing a choice that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the heart he'd forgotten he still possessed. "Grace," he said quietly, "what if it didn't have to be temporary this time?" Grace looked up, confusion clear in her expression. "What do you mean?" Alexander felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump without a parachute. Everything in his business training told him this was insane. Grace had been fired from her last job for overstepping boundaries. She was homeless, desperate, potentially unstable. Getting romantically involved with his son's caregiver violated every principle of appropriate employee-employer relationships. But James loved her. More than that, James was thriving under her care in ways that years of professional nannies and expensive therapists hadn't managed to achieve. And if Alexander was being completely honest with himself, he loved her too. "And mean," Alexander said slowly, "what if you didn't have to worry about me firing you when James gets older? What if you didn't have to prepare yourself to say goodbye in a few years when we don't need a nanny anymore?" Grace's eyes widened. "Alex, I don't understand what you're asking." Alexander stood up, began pacing the kitchen that had become the center of his world's transformation. I'm asking if you'd consider staying, not as an employee, as family." The silence that followed was so complete Alexander could hear his own heartbeat. "As family?" Grace repeated. Alexander stopped pacing and looked at her directly. "Grace, in 3 weeks, you've given James something I couldn't give him in 2 years. You've made him feel safe and loved and excited about life again. You've made him remember what it feels like to be a child." He paused, searching for words to explain something he barely understood himself. "But more than that," Alexander continued, "you've reminded me what it feels like to be human. You've shown me that love isn't something you schedule or optimize or manage. It's something you do every day in little ways, just like you told James." Grace was staring at him like he was speaking a foreign language. "Alex, what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm in love with you," Alexander said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. "I'm in love with the way you make pancakes with faces. I'm in love with the way you read stories like they're the most important thing in the world. I'm in love with the way you see James, not as a project to be improved, but as a person to be cherished exactly as he is." Alexander sat back down, reaching across the counter to take Grace's hands. "I'm in love with your courage, your honesty, your refusal to give up on people who need love, even when loving them costs you everything. I'm in love with you, Grace, and I want to know if there's any chance you could love me back." Grace pulled her hands free, stood up, and walked to the kitchen window that looked out over Manhattan's glittering lights. Alexander watched her shoulders rise and fall with careful breaths, watched her wrap her arms around herself like she was trying to hold something together. "Alex," she said without turning around, "you don't know what you're asking." "I think I do." "No, you don't." Grace's voice was thick with emotion. "You're asking a woman who has lost everything she's ever loved to risk losing it again.
You're asking someone who has been disappointed by every man who ever promised her forever to believe that this time might be different." She turned to face him, and Alexander saw fear in her eyes that went deeper than job security or personal comfort. "You're asking me to love James like he's mine, knowing that if this doesn't work out, I'll have to walk away from another child I can't live without. You're asking me to trust that you won't change your mind when the novelty wears off, when you remember that I'm not from your world, when your friends and colleagues start asking questions about the homeless woman you married." "Married?" Alexander stood up. "Grace, I haven't. Haven't you?" Grace's laugh was sharp with pain. "Because what you're describing isn't dating, Alex. It isn't some casual relationship where we see how things go. You're talking about building a family with James. You're talking about me loving your son like he's mine. That's not something you experiment with. That's marriage." Alexander felt the truth of that settle over him like a blanket. She was right. What he was asking for was marriage, not just to Grace, but to the idea of building a real family, of choosing love over safety, of trusting that some risks were worth taking. "You're right," he said simply. "I am talking about marriage. I'm talking about adopting James together if something happens to me. I'm talking about making you James's legal mother so that no one can ever take him away from you again." Grace's sharp intake of breath told him his words had hit their mark. "I'm talking about building the family we both lost, Grace, together." Grace was quiet for so long that Alexander began to think he had completely misjudged the situation. Maybe she didn't feel anything for him beyond professional appreciation. Maybe he had confused her care for James with something more personal. Maybe he was just another desperate widower projecting his needs onto the nearest available woman. But then Grace walked back to the counter, sat down across from him, and said something that changed everything. "I'm already in love with James," she said quietly. "I've been in love with him since the first day he fell asleep in my arms. And I'm terrified, Alex, because I know what it feels like to lose a child I love, and I don't think I could survive it again." Alexander felt hope bloom in his chest. "And I'm falling in love with you too, with the man who came home early just to sit in a blanket fort with his son, with the father who defended me against social services, even though he barely knew my real story, with the person who sees me as more than just the help, who talks to me like my thoughts matter, who makes me feel like I belong somewhere again." Grace looked down at her hands and back up at Alexander. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not Catherine. I can't replace James's mother, and I'm not going to try. If we do this, if we really do this, it has to be about building something new, not about filling a hole left by someone else." "I know that," Alexander said. "Grace, I loved Catherine with everything I had. But what I feel for you, it's different. It's not about replacing anyone or filling any void. It's about choosing to build something beautiful with someone who makes me want to be better than I am." Alexander reached for her hands again, and this time she didn't pull away. "Grace Washington," he said, "will you marry me? Will you be James's mother? Will you help me figure out how to be a family?" Grace looked at him for a long moment, and Alexander saw her weighing all the risks, all the possibilities for heartbreak, all the reasons this could go wrong. Then she smiled, the first completely unguarded, joyful smile he'd seen from her, and said, "Yes." Alexander woke up at 4:47 a.m., just like always, but instead of immediately reaching for his phone to check overnight markets or urgent emails, he lay still for a moment, processing the events of the night before. Grace had said yes. Not just to dating him, not just to continuing to care for James, but to marriage, to building a family, to taking the enormous risk of loving both of them completely, knowing that love could be lost, that promises could be broken, that happiness was always fragile. But she had said yes anyway. Alexander smiled in the dark of his bedroom, feeling something he hadn't experienced since Catherine died, anticipation for a future that wasn't just about achievement or accumulation, but about joy, about waking up every morning in a house full of people who chose to love each other. His phone buzzed with the first of what would undoubtedly be dozens of urgent messages, but for the first time in his professional life, Alexander turned it off. Today, he was going to tell his son that Grace was going to stay forever. Alexander found them in the kitchen, just like every morning, but this time the scene looked different to him. Not like an employer observing his employees' work, but like a man watching his future wife care for their child. Grace was helping James measure ingredients for what appeared to be homemade waffles, and James was taking his duties as sous chef very seriously, his tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated on leveling the measuring cup. "Morning, Daddy," James called without looking up from his work. "Grace is teaching me about chemical reactions. Did you know that when you mix the wet ingredients with the dry ingredients, they start changing into something completely different?" "Is that right?" Alexander said, accepting the mug of coffee Grace offered him with a smile that made his heart skip. "Yep," James continued his explanation. "Grace says cooking is just chemistry you can eat. And she says that's like lots of things in life. When you combine the right ingredients in the right way, you can make something beautiful that never existed before." Alexander met Grace's eyes over James's head and saw the promise there, the understanding that they were about to create something beautiful that had never existed before. "James," Alexander said, sitting down at the counter, "Grace and I need to talk to you about something important." James immediately looked worried, the way children do when adults use serious voices. "Are you going to fire Grace? Because if you are, I want to file a complaint with management." Alexander laughed beside himself. "File a complaint with management?" "Grace taught me about workplace rights," James said solemnly. "She says everyone deserves to be treated fairly, and Grace is the best nanny in the world, so firing her would be very unfair." "James," Grace said gently, "your daddy isn't going to fire me, but we do have something important to tell you." James looked between them, clearly trying to read the situation. "Is it good news or bad news?" "What do you think?" Alexander asked. James studied their faces with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. Alexander was smiling, Grace was smiling. Nobody looked sad or angry or stressed. "Good news?" James guessed hopefully. "Very good news," Alexander confirmed. "James, how would you feel if Grace didn't just work for us? How would you feel if she was part of our family, forever?" James's eyes got very wide. Like she would be my new mommy?" Alexander and Grace exchanged glances. They had talked about this the night before, about how to navigate the delicate territory of James's feelings about his birth mother and his readiness for a stepmother. "Like she would love you like a mommy loves you," Grace said carefully, "but you would still have your first mommy in your heart always. I would never try to take her place, baby. I would just add more love." James considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher. "So, I would have mommy in heaven and Grace mommy?" "If that's what you want to call me," Grace said softly. "And Grace would live here forever? She wouldn't have to leave when I get bigger?" "She would never have to leave," Alexander confirmed. James launched himself off his stool into Grace's arms with such force that he nearly knocked her over. "Yes!" he shouted. "Yes, yes, yes! I want Grace to be my forever mommy!" Later that afternoon, after James had called Mrs. Chen to share the news, and after Mrs. Chen had cried and hugged everyone and declared that she had been praying for exactly this outcome, Alexander realized he had proposed marriage without a ring. "We should go shopping," he told Grace. "You should choose something you love." But Grace shook her head. "Alex, I don't need a big ring. I don't need expensive jewelry. I just need you and James."
"Grace," Alexander said seriously, "you're going to be Mrs. Alexander Sterling. You're going to be part of one of the most prominent families in New York. People can expect whatever they want," Grace interrupted. "I'm not marrying your reputation, Alex. I'm not marrying your money or your social status. I'm marrying you." That evening, Alexander presented Grace with something that made her cry harder than any diamond could, a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother, paired with a small diamond that had been Catherine's, not her engagement ring, but a pendant she had loved reset into a ring that honored both the past and the future. "It's perfect," Grace whispered, slipping it onto her finger. "It's absolutely perfect." They were married 3 weeks later in the living room where James had built his first blanket fort, with only Mrs. Chen, Harold, Marcus, and a handful of close friends as witnesses. Grace wore a simple white dress that cost less than Alexander's ties, and James served as both ring-bearer and best man, taking his duty so seriously that he forgot to smile until the judge pronounced them husband and wife. But when Alexander kissed Grace for the first time as married people, James cheered so loudly that the neighbors probably heard him 40 stories down. 1 year later. The kitchen island where it all began now serves breakfast to a family of 3 every morning. Sometimes Alexander still has to leave early for urgent meetings, but more often than not, he works from home until after James leaves for school, staying long enough to hear about dreams and plans for the day and to receive sticky-fingered hugs goodbye. Grace no longer lives in transitional housing. She lives in a penthouse on the Upper East Side, but more importantly, she lives in a home where her love is returned, where her heart is safe, where she belongs completely. And James? James is 6 now. Still brilliant, still curious, still learning piano and French and all the things that will prepare him for the world he'll inherit. But he's also learning to make cookies and build blanket forts and feed ducks in the park. He's learning that love is something you do every day, in little ways, just like his Grace mommy taught him. Most mornings, Alexander Sterling still wakes up at 4:47 a.m., but now, instead of immediately reaching for his phone, he rolls over and watches his wife sleep for a few minutes, marveling at the miracle of second chances, of unexpected love, of hearts brave enough to risk everything for the possibility of joy. And when James crawls into their bed at 6 a.m., which happens most weekends, despite Grace's gentle attempts to encourage independent sleeping, Alexander doesn't mind the interruption. He pulls his son close, feels Grace's arms wrap around both of them, and thinks about how much richer he is now than when his only wealth was money. Because Alexander Sterling learned something that 3 Harvard degrees and a billion-dollar empire couldn't teach him. The most valuable things in life can't be bought, sold, or negotiated. They can only be given freely, received gratefully, and cherished completely. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they come disguised as a woman making breakfast in your kitchen, holding your child like he's precious, teaching you both what it means to be loved.